I am so thrilled to be in conversation with Bianca Bosker because her body of work is insanely enlightening. And in fact, I am walking around. I didn't just read her book, Get the Picture, which is going to make you want to go to every art gallery you can possibly go to and use the wisdom that she has imparted. You are going to feel so in control. It's going to be fantastic. But first of all, I'm Michael Schulder, and I'm a member of the board of the Nantucket Book Festival. And I'm a journalist, and I've been in network news for many, many years, and I'm the creator of something called Wavemaker Conversations. Bianca is not just the author of 2 books, but she has such a broad span of work, totally driven by curiosity. In fact, if you wait 1 second, I want to just read to you some of the names of the articles that'll give you an idea of Bianca's span of work. I hope you remember all these. So here we go.
This is a real journalist. You have done your background research. I'm very impressed.
You were a real journalist because in your book, you said you are such a thorough fact checker that you're the kind of person who would fact check a love letter.
Right, yes.
Do you have a husband?
I do have a husband, yes.
Have you ever?
There's been some quotes where I'm like, I've thought about maybe just Googling, just to be sure that the correct attribution was given, yeah.
Well, just to give you a sample, the cheating scandal that has shaken the world of master sommeliers, which was an article you wrote for The New Yorker, right? And this is how I was starting to conflate your work because I had a cappuccino before I came here and it was too hot and it burned my tongue a little bit. And you had an anecdote in there about how sensitive the sommelier's taste buds are. Just tell me.
Oh, yeah. Well, I haven't read that story in quite a while, so you'll have to fact check my anecdote. But I will say, yeah, so before Get the Picture, I trained as a sommelier, and that was the book that I wrote called Cork Dork. And as part of that, I understood just how seriously these somms take everything that happens basically in this area of the body. So, and I think of it sort of like if you've ever seen people like primping their dogs at the Westminster Dog Show, like it's that, but on a whole other level. It is superstition, it is deep, not brushing your teeth before tastings, not eating before tastings, waking up to practice for high stress tastings by getting in the middle of the night to get yourself on the time zone of the place you'll be. I mean, it's not just giving up coffee and cigarettes, it's a whole lifestyle that's designed to protect. I think there was actually someone who talked about taking out insurance on his nose because it was so key for his skills as a somm.
And by the way, just to give you a sense of how Bianca learns everything you're about to say, you don't learn this because you did a couple of interviews. Just tell them how you got immersed, and then we're going to get to your book, I promise.
Yeah, I can take us there. But first, I do want to say thank you for joining me, and thank you all for taking time out of this absolutely beautiful June day to not be at the beach or not be at Cisco, but to be here with us discussing words. It means especially a lot to me because not only am I obsessed with writing and books, but I wrote a great deal of Get the Picture at the Athenaeum, and so it just feels so special and kind of surreal to be here sharing it with you all. I was mostly camped out next to the periodicals, and when the library would close, I was that insane person that you may see in the garden with her laptop while everyone else was at the beach. But I did it. We're here. It's out. And so yeah, my reporting process, you're right, I believe in learning by doing. And so while, like a lot of journalists, I do interviews, I read books, I read very dry research reports, I also believe in throwing myself in the middle of the action. And so for both of these projects, they start with questions, and it started with this intellectual curiosity, but it was something that very quickly spiraled into this spiritual concern, where I was like, I don't want to understand the world of wine or the world of art as just a journalist. I want to understand it as a human being. I'm someone who's really obsessed with obsession, and in both cases, these worlds are filled with these people who have this magnetic passion for this thing, be it wine or art, and it was this thing that I did not appreciate, I did not understand, and in both cases, I had this really existential concern, this thing that I can only describe as like a seismic activity on the level of my soul where I was like, oh my God, maybe everything I've thought about how to live my life is totally wrong. And the only way I can answer it is by getting into the middle of the action, training as a som, as the case may be, for Cork Dork or Forget the Picture. I basically disowned my normal life for 5 years to work at art galleries, sell art, help artists in their studios. I was a security guard at a museum. If you tried to take a picture with flash at the Guggenheim, I probably came over to tell you not to. For me, there's a couple of different reasons. One is, it's very different to ask a gallerist how to sell a painting than it is to spend, 5 days on your feet during Art Basel Miami Beach, schmoozing with millionaires and selling thousands of dollars of art from the backseat of an Uber while people are doing cocaine around you, which, I have now done. Not the cocaine, the selling the art part. Sorry, yeah.
Does cocaine make people more inclined to buy expensive art or not?
It makes them more inclined to talk at quick speeds about the art they're looking at, I would say.
So just one more thing before we get into art, because again, it's anything Bianca comes across that sort of strikes her as important to learn about. So you live in New York and you wrote a book on these, have you all noticed in New York, these super tall, super slim buildings that have just gone to outrageous heights? And one of my favorite articles of yours is The Marvels and Mistakes of Super Talls, and it begins with this sentence, and then I just want you to give us a little background on what you learned. It begins with this sentence: "It was a sunny day in New York when I realized that my sky was being stolen." She wants to find out who was stealing it and how and why.
Yeah, so, I think that for me, I love stories that on the surface seem somewhat niche, but when you get into them, actually reveal very big truths about the moment we're in, about how to live our life. I think that Cork Dork ostensibly is about wine, but to me it's actually about it's an argument for embracing these neglected senses of taste and smell. It's about the virtues of living life more sensefully. Get the Picture is ostensibly about art, but it's actually, I think, this quest and sort of a roadmap for how to live life more expansively. And so I think that this super tall story was, on the surface, it's like, okay, it seems sort of like a New York problem, right? Like, okay, you've got this new breed of skyscrapers taking over. People hate them. They're so tall. And I think deep down, it is ultimately this story about this kind of endless quest for human height and like what possesses us as people to keep reaching for the heavens. And also this really kind of tricky relationship that we have with technology and the way it inserts itself into our lives. But yeah, it was a crazy story. I went into the most expensive apartment I've ever been into. It was like, I don't know, you can fact check this, but it was like $180 million apartment on like the 80th floor of one of these buildings. And it was really nice.
Which is, it was really nice, but as you said in the piece, these buildings, you learned, behave unpredictably.
They move, yeah, they move. They're like a drunken giraffe, basically. They're designed to move 6 to 8 feet in either direction. And I think the other thing I will say is, which I didn't realize, is all buildings move. I was talking to these engineers, and they're like, yes, that's crazy, but basically if you're in a building above 10 feet, it's probably moving, which most of us don't like to think about, but especially in Nantucket, where the erosion is happening. There's a lot of buildings maybe not listing side to side, but like limping slightly,
So now let's get the picture, because whatever elevated insights you get, you start at the bottom, at the ground floor. In fact, I'm looking at how you're dressed, and I'm hyper aware now. I'm wondering how a gallery owner who was looking to hire you, and you had gallery assistant jobs, what would they have said about what you're wearing? Would you have gotten the job with this, or would you have been dismissed with that outfit?
Well, I have been very well trained at this point by the art world, so I think this outfit would have been somewhat passable. But I will say it was a real trial by fire. So I had this goal. So, I will say that going into this, Art and I were not on speaking terms. Art had been a passion of mine growing up, but for much of my adult life, I really withdrew from art and the art world. Like, I would go to galleries and museums, and I felt like I was at least 2 tattoos and a master's degree away from figuring out what the heck was going on. Like, the art did not make sense to me, the rituals, the language. And so for a long time, like I said, I withdrew. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I began to be haunted by this fear that by turning my back on art, I was missing out on something really big. And when I started trying to reconnect with the art world, I couldn't look away. I'd never met a group of people willing to sacrifice so much for something of, to me, so little obvious practical value. And like I said, that passion, that obsession was so striking to me. It really, on the one hand, was perplexing. I was like, what is the big deal about art, right? What is it that they're seeing in this sculpture of decaying vegetables on a stained mattress that I'm not getting? And I think another part of it was that they had this approach to life that made my own existence feel claustrophobic by comparison. I was, I'm not ashamed to admit it. I mean, I am actually really ashamed to admit it. But, I was a sort of, hyper-optimized yuppie who would text from the toilet while listening to podcasts at 2x speed. Like, this is not a healthy way of living, people. And artists, they acted like they'd access these trap doors in their brains. It was just exciting. It was weird. Like, they did things like go home and, they said their art practice consisted of pulling out pieces of garbage from their trash and inspecting it. And I was like, that is either brilliant or bullshit, right? But I wanted to figure out which it was. And then they also said that I lacked visual literacy, which they said was downright dangerous in an age where we're so saturated with images. And so long story short, I wanted to get in there, wanted to figure it out. And so initially, I thought that I would be welcomed with open arms. I thought everyone bemoans the lack of art journalism these days. And I figured someone that was, these people who were so excited about what they're doing, we just couldn't wait for a journalist to come knocking on their door with open, eager beaver curiosity. I couldn't have been more wrong. And maybe I was naive, but I hadn't spent time in the art world, and people started reaching out to them, curators, consultants, dealers, artists, and no one wanted to talk to me. I got threats, warnings. There was one gallerist who told me that if I wrote anything he disagreed with, he would trash my reputation, psychological, personal, professional. Another dealer or a collector, when I told him my plan of trying to go work in the art world as a journalist, he basically was like, this is not a good idea if you want to keep living in New York City. It was sort of suggested witness protection might be in order. And it really took me aback. I mean, I felt like an FBI agent trying to get in with the mob. And of course, as you know, as a journalist, nothing gets a journalist's attention like being told to stop asking questions. So to answer your question about my wardrobe, I eventually did find a job at a very cool gallery in Brooklyn where I began to be initiated into what I could describe as the strategic snobbery that the art world uses to keep people out. And it is not only journalists, it is all of us. It is the general public, or as one of my bosses referred to it, the Joe Schmoes. That should give you some sense of the regard in which people are held. But yeah, so it was told to me that I needed a dress code, right? No jewelry, severe haircut. I was told that I looked like I worked for a catering company, which if the shoe fits, but also felt like not the thing that you really expect to hear for the person that you're working for. I had an overly enthusiastic personality. You may have noticed if you spent time in the art world that people, really serious art people, kind of exclusively discuss art in this very affectless monotone that makes them sound like they're running out of batteries. Art speak, there was just all these barriers to entry. So, I was...
Art speak, you say art speak.
Yeah.
There is a lingo.
It's a code. It's a code,
and now you've revealed it to us. I can't wait again to go into the galleries and start speaking in code. People are going to be so impressed.
Oh my God.
By the way, if I wore these clothes and I spoke in code, would it be, how would they feel? Be honest, be honest.
Yeah. I would say, I think you look like you might own a yacht and have some money to spend on a painting.
I didn't mean to be that honest. Okay. But give me some lingo. Give us some takeaway phrases so we know what this art
Well,
world
I
is
have
made
to
of.
preface this by saying that as a writer, art speak gives me hives. I mean, art speak, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but is, basically to sound like you know something about art, the trick is to sound like a French professor who's been the victim of a terrible translation job. And that is actually, some people argue, where art speak came from. But, like what the art critic calls indexical marks of the artist's body would be finger painting to you and me. One of my bosses was like, no, you never say that a work is sold, it's placed. You send out sales pitches to potential clients, you send out offers. Like you're doing them a really big favor by giving them this opportunity to spend $10,000 on a painting.
By the way, speaking of placed, I was shocked to hear that if a potential client comes in with significant resources, that's not enough to get the gallerist to even want to place a work of art in your home, no matter how much money they will make. Why is that?
Yeah, so it certainly depends on the gallerist. But yes, there are those, I worked with someone who basically turned up his nose at selling art to people who worked in certain sectors of finance. He was like, I don't want their money. And that's, sometimes the artist may have a different opinion on that. But I think that what this comes down to is context. And context, when I first heard it in the art world, I was like, oh, it's just this throwaway word. We hear about context all the time. It's like, oh, the context of why we're here, or But context in the art world is something so real, so precious. It's like you can almost hold it in your hand like a gold bar. And as I said, I was really on this quest to develop my eye. I wanted to not just stare in an artwork's direction, but actually see it, engage with it, have a conversation with it. And I was taken aback by just how many art connoisseurs spent, to me, surprisingly little time discussing the merits of the art itself, and instead asking questions like, what gallery has shown this artist? Or what school did they go to? Or who are they sleeping with right now? And all of that is the context, right? Context is sort of the web of names around an artist. It's the social cachet of the artist. And as I said before, I trained as a somm. And when you're a sommelier, you do a lot of blind tasting. You get a glass of wine, and you just, based on only that liquid, you have to figure out, where did it come from? When was it made? What grapes was it made with? And in that process, you learn to stay true to your own felt experience. You have to ignore all the things that are designed to play to your sensory biases. And so this emphasis on context, I think, was a real culture shock for me coming into this world, because I felt like I was being told, no, all the things that you might think you know and experience as an individual in front of this work of art, you can't, as someone put it, you can't understand what the F you're looking at unless you know the context. It was sort of like all the information you might get from the work is somehow totally irrelevant compared to what you might read on a wall label or in a history book, or learn from going to art fairs and figuring out who's friends with who. And so in terms of selling you a work of art, I don't know your whole context, but part of these deliberately erected barriers to entry that exist in the art world extend to selling the work. So they oftentimes don't list prices, and then they will refuse to sell you things even if they're for sale, oftentimes because you, as the buyer, lack the right context.
What would be the right context?
The right context is, you sit on many museum boards. Like if you buy the art, you can now support the artist by, let's say, donating the work to the museum when you die, or preferably earlier. You have so much money that you'll never be tempted to sell the artwork later on if that artist appreciates. Preferably, you have summoned your money out of thin air. So, there's nothing dirty about the way that you've, made your money. So basically, I think the ideal collector is like this mythical, pediatric oncologist who has served the world but somehow has inherited millions and is starting a private museum.
And speaking of prices, because that's again was a perspective changer for me. You spent a lot of time working hard, assisting other artists. Like that was one of your jobs, and you would stretch canvases and you would learn how to, what's that first coat called?
Priming, yeah.
Priming a canvas. And
yeah.
and our oldest child, who went to SAIC, so that's a good start, right?
That's
School of the Artists.
Good context.
Good
Okay,
context.
that's a very good school. Yeah.
And they're excellent visual artists, and I have watched them stretch canvas, and they had me prime a canvas. I suspect, after reading you, that they didn't end up using my primed canvas. Tell us what you learned about just the canvas, and then I want to get back to the money before we go to questions.
Yeah, so I'll say that, you know, one of my favorite things that I did was working with artists in their studios. And I was really committed as part of this journey. You know, I felt, before I just jumped into writing a book, I did read as many books as I possibly could about art. And I did feel very frustrated about the way that a lot of them dealt with parts of this world in isolation. You know, they talk about the market, or they talk about the history, or it'd be an artist's biography. But I think to understand art, and especially contemporary art, all of these pieces of the machine work together. And so that's why I wanted to see these different phases. I wanted to see, like, ultimately, how does an artwork go from being this germ of an idea in someone's studio to this quote-unquote masterpiece that we obsess over in museums? Because I felt like all the decisions that affect the work are also decisions that affect us. Our idea of what art is, who makes it, why we should engage with it. And you know, as I said, I had this sort of frustrations initially when it came to developing my eye, and it wasn't until I started working with artists in their studios that I feel like something clicked. And I think what it was is I began to understand how to look at art more like an artist. And to me, that meant slowing down. It meant examining the physical form of the piece. It meant examining the decisions that an artist made. And that may sound very obvious, but in some ways that flies in the face of, I think, so much of what we're told about art today. For the last 100 years, we've been told that what really matters about an artwork is the idea behind it. Like, the thought trumps the thing. And in part, we can thank, you know, Marcel Duchamp for that. Like, he's credited, right, for taking a urinal and sticking it on a pedestal and calling it art. And, you know, he really was against the whole idea of, like, retinal art that just pleased the eye but not the brain. He thought the Impressionists were, like, just And yet, as Julie Curtis, one of the artists I worked for, told me, she was like, an idea is not a painting. Painting is constant decision-making. And when you see artists in their studio, if you make art yourself as an artist, you know that making art is not this, like, antiseptic process of, like, swifting, you know, swirling brandy and contemplating sunbeams while, you know, thinking about Foucault. Like, it is athletic, it is blistery. I mean, I almost lost, like, you know, fingers while I was stapling these canvases. And I think that there's just this wrestling that goes on with the laws of nature. Like, every piece, it's you know, you have to make things stick, stay, lay. And when artists get together, oftentimes the conversations they have are not about dead German philosophers, but about, like, what brand of oil paint do you use? How many times do you prime and sand your canvases? Where do you get your, you know, linen for your canvases? And so I think, to me, that was kind of a lesson in staying in the work. It was, for me, a kind of revelation that all the information that we need to have a meaningful experience of art is right in front of us. And I remember, actually, when I started working as a guard, now I am someone that used to love wall labels. When I would go to museums, I felt like it was just rude and hostile when they didn't have, you know, a paragraph-long explanation next to every work. I was like, I mean, I'm a writer, like, I love words. I'm like, how am I supposed to understand what I'm looking at unless you explain it to me in English? And when I started working at Guggenheim, I actually started standing in front of the wall labels because I felt like they were so, actually prevented people from going deeper with the artwork. And there was actually something, it's kind of a throwaway thing, but it actually ended up being so wise that an artist told me, which was, when you're looking at an artwork, you just have to start by just trying to notice 5 things about it. And they don't have to be grandiose. It is not like, you know, this probes masculinity in the post-internet age. It could just be, this green makes me want to touch it, right? This hand looks like a starfish. And those are the decisions. And staying in the work, slowing down. We do look at work too quickly. There's studies that show that we spend, you know, more time reading the wall labels than looking at the work. And even then, it's like, you know, a handful of seconds. But slowing down, staying in the work, I think, are ways to bypass the context, to brush away the snobbery, and to really begin to look at art face to face in a way that has less pretense, but also more magic and mystery than, at least for me, than I'd ever seen before.
And by the way, everything you're saying, it sounds, well, this was sort of a joyful journey for you. And I was sort of surprised, and it left an impression on me that you really felt a lot of stress when you were working for these people, because they knew you were a journalist, but you were actually doing serious work. As a matter of fact, now it sounds like you could put on an exhibition, you could lead it, and it would be a great exhibition because you know every moving part, but you took your jobs very seriously. So just tell us about tell us about how you handled the stress.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were, so I would say, it was very stressful at parts. I mean, I think that...
I should say, give me one example of where you just went home after a day and you knew this was a part of a book and you were just like so stressed out, you might need to change jobs.
Right, so, I think that initially I had this experience of working for someone who was incredibly wise in so many ways, had an amazing eye, was running a very interesting program, was showing the kind of difficult art that I didn't really understand but wanted to. And I should say that among the quote-unquote pure of the art world, so people who consider money kind of tacky and tasteless, there is a sort of spectrum of art. And on the one hand, you have so-called couch art, which is muttered with so much disdain, you have to get out a mop and pick it, it's just dripping with contempt. Couch art is synonymous with colorful painting. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have fuck you art, basically, which is, needless to say, what the art critics would call ungenerous, the kind of work that you look at and you're like, that's art? It's am I on candid camera? What is? So I worked with someone who showed something closer to the sort of market unfriendly, FU side of things. And it was a very interesting working relationship where, how would I put this? So I got a lot of feedback, like I said, about the ways that I didn't quite fit into the art world. I was told, this is basically verbatim because you don't forget this kind of thing, but over lunch one afternoon, he told me, you're not the coolest cat in the art world, so having you around, it's just like lowering my coolness. And so I would get this sort of feedback, and initially I was like, okay, well, look, I just want to fit in. I want to have this job. Every door has been closed to me. I will do whatever it takes to keep this, to hold on to this. If you want me to repaint that wall 9 times, which in fact he did want me to do, I will do it. And yet, this began to evolve into these very strange lectures about I remember when we were installing someone's work and I was like, oh yeah, I haven't been to the gym recently. And he was like, it shows. Or he would sit me down to walk me through a critique of articles I'd written for The Atlantic, which is, every writer's dream, to say the least. And it was just, but it was tough. It was, I think, to your point about the stress, it was this, the art world is very small. And I did feel like if this door closed, there wouldn't be many others open to me. But at the same time, there did come a point where I felt like I sort of had that experience. I had learned what I could from that time. And then people started talking about Miami and, the absolute insanity that goes on there. As one person said, it's so Miami is short for Miami Art Week, which is short for this week-long bacchanal of pills, powders, parties that is held in the name of shopping for art. And someone described it to me as, it's like the bourgeois indulgence that precedes a communist revolution. And I was like, this I have to see. And so that sort of, spurred me to find a gallery that would take me with them to Miami and sell art with them. But I will say that ultimately, there were moments that were, of course, very difficult, but I also had the luxury of being a journalist, right? I wasn't someone who was trying to make a forever career in the art world. And so I think that as bad as things may have gotten or unpleasant in the moments, it wasn't nearly as bad as things I heard from other people. I mean, having things thrown at them, having, wages withheld, being kind of held prisoner, doing work out of state without getting any money to actually fly back to your home. I mean, really crazy stuff. And I will say that I did receive a lot of skepticism from many people in the art world about sort of me as a journalist coming into this world as an outsider to write about it. and again, I'm biased as a journalist, but I think that sometimes you need people who are third-party, observers who have the ability to call out the things the way they are. And so I think that the book also, I think of it sort of as a user guide, and in some respects, to the hidden logic of the art world. And it is a very hidden logic, and it is a very deliberately hidden logic. And I think a lot of people perhaps are not in a position to be able to reveal those things because, if you want to keep working there, if you want to keep living in New York City. I'm actually about to change my name and move to Minneapolis as part of my witness protection program. It's you're kind of not allowed to do that.
I just want to say one more thing before I open it up to questions, because you talked about the worst things that could possibly happen to people in the art world and artists, and that couldn't have happened to you. I was shocked again to find out that one of the worst things that can happen to an artist, and it started to happen to one of the artists you assisted and you worked for and followed over a couple of years, is that your work starts to sell at auction for a lot of money. This is actually potentially dangerous and existential for your career. Explain that. And then, we'll open it up to questions.
It's very counterintuitive. So I was working for an artist at this fascinating point in her career. And I should say that from the get-go, I was really fascinated by these up-and-coming emerging artists. That, to me, is the least covered and highest stakes part of the art world. We hear so much about the big money, the big names, but that's just not representative of most people's experience. And also, I wanted to see the bloody business of art history getting made. So I was working with this artist who was at this point of, she had sort of just been able to sell enough of her own work through her gallery to quit her day job and do her own work full time. That is kind of every artist's dream. They're not dreaming about being in the Met, they're just dreaming about making enough money that they can work one job instead of 5. And at that same moment, when I started working with her, her work started selling at auction for huge sums of money, as you said. There was one painting that she made about $600 when she sold it initially that was sold for something like $400,000, $500,000, of which she saw $0. And you might, if you don't know the art world, you might think, oh my God, this is amazing. She can sell her art, she's gonna make millions, right? And this, for her, these sales at auction were taken by many in the art world as the sign that this sort of horrible disease had infected her career. And part of it was that she was still kind of early in her career, and so the fact that people were selling this early, maybe was a sign that they weren't confident that her work would be worth more in the future, that it wasn't worth holding on to. And so the fear is it would set off this whole spiral of selling, kind of short selling by collectors. And I think that, to me, that's interesting because it goes back to just the outsized emphasis on context, right? There's nothing about her work that changed. It's the same painting, it's just now has been sold on the secondary market at auction for a lot more money. And that, of course, totally transforms the way people see it. And so I will say that before we open it up, I do think, it kind of began to dawn on me as I got further into this, that I think that context is such a tempting shortcut to rely on because that is how our brains are wired to work. When we look at the world, we do not see it like video cameras. We do not, have these objective, dispassionate view of the world. Our vision is pretty blurry, most of it. We have like a tiny area in focus. And more than that, our brains are these trash compactors. We have these filters of expectation that descend and preemptively dismiss, prioritize, sort all the raw data coming in even before we get the full picture. And so one argument that really resonated with me for why art is so fundamental is that it helps us fight those reducing tendencies of our minds. It helps us pull off those filters of expectation. It's a bit like a dream. It introduces these strange, maybe unpleasant, definitely new experiences that are a glitch, and it's a glitch that is a gift, and it's a glitch that helps our brains jump the curb to be more nimble and more open to new experience. And I think that is so exciting, and to that extent, there's an artist in each of us to the extent that we really commit to fight those compressing tendencies of our minds. But now we're gonna open those tendencies of your minds. Yeah, please.
Yes. Yes, over there. Can you stand up and yes? Oh, actually, there's a mic coming to you. Here we go.
Thanks. I really found that fascinating. So I really appreciate your sharing your your thoughts and your process. I was just curious at a very fundamental level, why this topic? Where did it originally come from, and how did you latch onto it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, you know, the kind of initial spark happened when I was back home in my childhood home in Oregon, helping my mom clean out her basement, which is really where every good book idea starts. It's just a plea to help your moms clean their basement. And I happened to come across this painting of dancing carrots. And it was a painting by my late grandmother that was inspired by her time as a Holocaust survivor in a displaced persons camp after the war. And she, at the time, had no children of her own. She had no artistic inclination that I know of. She had trained as an economist. And when she was in that camp, she started teaching art classes to the children. And one of the things she did was to help them like scrimp together materials to make costumes for a dance performance. And she thought about long and hard about what they were going to dress up as, and had to try and settle on a costume that was going to be like lively but politically innocuous. So she was like, birds, no, they could evoke bombers. Apples, ooh, like the red might seem, like a communist sympathizer Soviet thing. And so she settled on carrots, a decision that, according to her, then actually got her interrogated by some overeager official. But nonetheless, so from that point forward, art became a big part of her life. And this painting she made many years later, but it hung in her kitchen for until the day she died, for as long as I knew her. And every time I would visit her, she would tell me this story about the carrots, about the camp, about this performance. And so when I came across it, I'd really forgotten about her relationship with art. And these carrots trailed me back to New York, and they kept dancing my mind round and round this question of why she had treated art, which to me was the least essential thing, as essential, as this thing that she turned to when her life had turned itself inside out. And so I think for me, that was this feeling of just sort of that I had really misjudged something about art's place in our lives and how fundamental it was. And I was intrigued that artists argue that it's fundamental, but scientists argue that it's crucial to our existence. As one biologist puts it, it's as necessary to us as food or sex. It was not a feeling that I could relate to at the outset. It is one that I can relate to much more now.
Yes, Mary Haft.
First of all, it was so fascinating reading this book. For those of us that are not in the art world, it's like you literally pulled the screen away and let us understand on the inside. In some ways, that was like horrifying. So it's great to celebrate this book, but I kept reading, as my husband did too, and you're slogging your way through with really mean, hurtful, like kind of hateful things said about you and how you're made to feel. And I kept thinking, what allowed you to stick to this? To keep it, because there's no guarantee you're going to have a great book. There's no guarantee when you're doing this. What kept you going day by day in places in which I might have thrown in the towel and said, maybe I better think of something else?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind words, and thank you to your husband for reading it. I think that, first of all, I think it's just partially stubbornness and also just dogged curiosity. I mean, I think that as a writer and as a journalist, I feel like I have the best job in the world because my job is to find interesting stories and tell them to people, right? To find out things that people don't know about or don't understand and share them. And so I think that, as strange as those things were in that moment, or as difficult that things could be in that moment, I had this curiosity, and I said it was a curiosity on a sort of intellectual level as a professional, but it was just a curiosity as a human being in this world. I think especially knowing the degree to which, again, scientists and artists talked about art as being so fundamental to the human experience, so essential to us as humans, so universal, right? I mean, art is one of our oldest inventions. We invented paint before the wheel. It's one of our oldest means of expressing ourselves. We were painting warthogs on walls long before we could write. And I felt like I deserve to figure this out. In some ways, I felt like turning my back on art was like turning my back on language. And so I couldn't do that. I just couldn't do that. And at the same time, there were times when it was tough, but also I was so lucky to discover and meet so many people who were so supportive, who were so generous, who really changed my life, not only as a viewer of art, but as a human being in this world. And I do think of the book as a love story. And like every love story, there is agony and there is ecstasy. And the last thing I'd say is, I think I was also inspired. I think it's a Nora Ephron quote, that everything is copy. So there was a part of me that I was there with my notebook and my tape recorder being like, oh yes, keep insulting me, sure. I mean, that's not, I would like to think that was my attitude in the moment. It wasn't. I was not nearly so, level-headed. I was like, please stop. But I think you just never know, too. And I think it wasn't until later I sort of do all my research and then take it back, like you do bring home the groceries from the supermarket and then sort of figure out what you're going to do with that. One more.
Other questions? Yes, back there.
I will say, if we don't get to all of your questions, we'll be hanging out outside, and I will be in the Athenaeum a lot, so you can just come and find me at the Athenaeum.
You are so good of a director, and by the way, your experience, I just have to tell one anecdote. We were sweating back there, it was hot, and because you have actually put on exhibitions, your first instinct was not to say, who can help to... You got these big pieces of wood and got a cross breeze going. You kicked the wood under the door there. So if
you wouldn't know it, but we did try and open that door.
Yeah, but she did it because at your heart, you're a gallerist. Anyway, go ahead.
So I'm kind of dying to know how Jack has reacted to how he was portrayed.
Look, I've shared copies of the book with every kind of the key people that are in the book. I have not heard back from everyone, who has read the book. The people who have read it and who are in it, who have gotten back to me, have been hugely positive and supportive. And, to the extent that, they've posted about it on Instagram, they've done book events with me. They were kind enough, as part of the book launch, I organized a mini art exhibit featuring work by some of the artists in the book, and they were kind enough to lend pieces for that. There was one couple that I write about who were like, we cried when we read it, in a good way. And they said it was in a good way, good crying. And I think, it's really a huge... It's a very interesting and dynamic relationship that you have as a writer with your source and, with these I don't call them source, with these human beings that you're writing about. And there's a huge level of trust. It becomes incredibly intimate. And, you can't help but really just, I care so much for each of the people in the book. And my goal really, I actually hired a fact checker to help me with the book, which you do not have to do for a nonfiction book, because it is important to me that it is fair and accurate. And those are two slightly different things. And the fairness comes in, partially, it's like my hope is that people who read the book, who do know these people in person, read it and and recognize them on the page. And I've been very gratified to have a lot of people be like, oh my God, I know this person, she's just like that, you really captured her. And so that's kind of not an official fact-checking process that you can plan for, but nonetheless a wonderful sort of secondary check as a writer. So I want you as the readers, not everyone's going to get to meet Julie and Elizabeth and Rob and Jack, but I want you to feel like you've met them just by turning the pages.
And we do last question, if I can get you. Yes.
I was just wondering, in 50 years or 100 years from now, when art historians look back at this period, are they going to say, what were they thinking? Or are they, because the context will be lost by then, would be my guess. And the context also it sounds, from what I read, right, that it was a little mean, a little exclusive, a little kind of, a lot of angst. Will that be reflected in the art, or what do you think they'll say about this period?
Interesting. Well, I think that I love what you were thinking. It does call to mind an experience that we didn't talk about, and we are in a place of worship, so God forgive me, but one of the things I did for the book was I ended up meeting this artist who was a performance artist who had been working as an ass influencer. And you are, a crowd that comes to hear writers speak, during a day, so you probably don't know what an ass influencer is, but this is someone who has a very large social media following that they have attracted by posting photographs of their butt. And so, just to give you, anyway, so this, long story short, I thought this was totally absurd. I went to her opening. She was in lingerie. She was doing a live face sitting where she was sitting on people's faces, and she ended up sitting on my face for 7 minutes. So, yes, what were they thinking? I do think that context, I don't know, I think that there is, I'm not sure the extent actually to which context is lost. I think that oftentimes the immediate context gets baked into art history, and the further out we get, we may not, emphasize as much, oh, this person showed with this gallery or was friends with this artist and that's how they got ahead. But we almost begin to take for granted that this work is great. It's like the context fades, and then it becomes sort of self-perpetuating, right? I'm trying to think of an example, but there's actually an interesting study of the mere exposure effect, which argues that many of the works that we think are really fantastic we consider so great just because we've seen them a lot. And that in some ways familiarity does not breed contempt. Familiarity in an art context breeds celebration. And when I think about context in art history, to look at the continued power that it has, I think you need to look no further at the museum holdings. This is beginning to change a bit, but 87% of the artists who are in American museums are white men. And I think that is a sign of context, right? I don't personally believe that 87% of the art that was great, through history was made by, what I mean? It's like, that's context, right? Like your gender, your race, where you're making art, that's all context. And so I do think, I would like to believe that we're beginning to be able to look beyond that. There are people, many people also say that art historians have taken issue with me and saying that no, you need the context, that is crucial. I'm not saying you don't need it, I'm not saying it's never relevant. Reading the wall labels can be really helpful. My point is simply that we shouldn't rely on it as the single answer. I don't think there is a single right answer, and I think art history can often pretend or suggest that it is the final word on an artwork and that is the way into it.
Bianca Bosker, thank you. You are one of the coolest people, actually. That gallerist was wrong. Please buy her book.